The courtroom was thick with tension. On one side, the musician, a once celebrated rock icon, sat at the edge of his seat, staring intently at the judge. The years had taken their toll on him, his hair now graying, his movements slower, but there was still a fire in his eyes, the kind that had once ignited stadiums and created timeless anthems. This wasn't just any lawsuit. This was the last shot at reclaiming a lost piece of history, his history, and possibly the future of rock itself. The case was simple on the surface. The musician, let's call him Jack, was suing the record company for the return of his master tapes. The tapes, lost for decades, were more than just recordings. They were the missing link between two legendary eras of rock music, a treasure trove of sound that could rewrite the history of music. The story began in the late 1970s. Jack, who had already made a name for himself in the music world, was on the verge of something big. He had gathered a group of musicians, some of whom were already icons in their own right, and together, they went into the studio to create an album that would become the soundtrack to a new era. The sessions were electric, filled with raw energy and new ideas. The songs were unlike anything the world had heard before, combining elements of hard rock with blues, funk, and even early electronic sounds. There was talk that this album would be a turning point in rock history, a record that could bridge the gap between the late 60s psychedelia and the new wave of 80s music that was beginning to rise. But the tapes, once sent off to the record company for final processing, vanished. There were rumors, whispers among the band members, that the tapes had been destroyed in a fire or worse, were erased to make room for another project the company felt was more commercially viable. Whatever the reason, they were gone, and with them a chance to change the face of rock music forever. For decades, Jack let it go. He focused on other projects, toured with different bands, and kept his place in rock's history. But every now and then, the thought of those tapes would haunt him. What if they really had been something special? What if the world never got to hear that sound, that energy, that moment in time captured on reel-to-reel? And then, in the early 2000s, something happened. Jack received an anonymous tip. The tapes hadn't been destroyed after all. They had been locked away in a vault at the record company, forgotten or deliberately hidden for reasons Jack couldn't yet understand. What followed was a relentless pursuit of truth. The record company denied they even existed, but Jack wasn't willing to let it slide. He launched a lawsuit against them, demanding the return of the tapes, claiming they were a priceless historical artifact, not just valuable for him personally, but for the entire legacy of rock music. Now, here he was in the courtroom, facing the powerful record executives and their team of high-priced lawyers. The courtroom drama was reaching its boiling point. The record company's defense was simple. The tapes had been lost or destroyed years ago, and even if they existed, the rights to them belonged to the company. They argued that Jack had signed over those rights years ago, relinquishing any claim he might have had. But Jack wasn't backing down. He knew the tapes were more than just a set of songs. They were a link between two generations of music, a piece of rock history that could change everything. He brought in the witnesses, other musicians who had played on those sessions, and who had their own stories to tell. Some claimed the tapes contained tracks that could have changed the musical landscape entirely. Others hinted at personal conflicts, behind-the-scenes drama, and the feeling that something was taken from them, something they could never get back. And then, the courtroom was hit with the bombshell. One of the witnesses, a guitarist who had been part of the sessions, revealed something no one expected. He claimed that on one of the tapes there was an unknown track, a song that had never been heard before. This track, he said, was the missing link between the raw energy of the 60s and the more polished sound of the 80s. A song that, if released, could have altered the course of rock history. The tension in the courtroom skyrocketed. The judge called for a recess. Jack sat there, staring at the ground, his mind racing. If that song existed, if that song was out there, what would it mean for his legacy? What would it mean for rock music as a whole? But the questions didn't stop there. Who else knew about the song? Why had it been hidden all these years? And most importantly, was it still possible to retrieve those tapes? Or were they truly lost forever? As the courtroom emptied, Jack's fight was far from over. The mystery of the lost tapes, the unknown track, and the corporate secrets that might be buried within them were only beginning to unfold. And as Jack prepared for the next phase of the trial, he knew that the stakes were higher than he could ever have imagined. There were rumors, whispers that the tapes had been lost in transit, that they'd been damaged during shipping, or worse, that they'd been deliberately destroyed to make room for new, more commercial acts. But Jack never believed it. The studio had promised him that his music would be treated with the utmost respect. After all, this was no ordinary album. He'd poured everything into it, his heart, soul, and decades of experience. And those tapes weren't just recordings. They were a piece of rock history, a glimpse into what could have been the defining sound of a generation. Years passed and the music world moved on. Jack continued his career, but the sting of that loss never fully healed. He tried to put the pieces of that album together, working with what he could remember, but it was never the same. The sound was gone, the magic had disappeared. He was left with only the fading echoes of what might have been. In the late 80s, Jack stumbled across an article that hinted at the existence of the tapes. Someone had seen them. Someone had heard them. The music wasn't gone, it was just buried. The report claimed the tapes were still somewhere in the vaults of the record company, but they were lost among countless others from the era, forgotten in a sea of corporate negligence. Jack was filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. Could it be true? Could the tapes be out there, waiting to be discovered? He reached out to former bandmates and producers, people who had been part of that magical period. Some of them denied knowing anything, while others, who had long since faded into obscurity, spoke in hushed tones about a cover-up. One producer even claimed that the tapes had been misplaced by the company, only to disappear when the band's popularity started to wane. Another guitarist, who had played on several of the tracks, swore he'd heard rumors that the company had deliberately erased the tapes to make room for more mainstream, radio-friendly material. By the early 90s, Jack knew that if he wanted to find out the truth, he would have to take matters into his own hands. He filed his lawsuit against the record company, demanding that they either return the tapes or explain their whereabouts. The legal team at the company laughed at first. How could a musician, long past his prime, challenge the power of a global corporation? But Jack wasn't about to back down. He gathered his evidence, hired a lawyer who specialized in music rights, and prepared to take the fight to court. The day the lawsuit went public, the music world took notice. Headlines blared about the legendary musician suing the record company for the return of lost master tapes. And suddenly, everyone wanted to know, what was on those tapes? Fans speculated about the lost tracks, about what the world might have missed if only the album had been released. But the bigger question loomed. Could this really be the missing link between the 70s and the new wave of rock in the 80s? As the legal battle began, Jack's former bandmates were subpoenaed to testify. Some of them, now living in the shadows of their former glory, were hesitant to speak. Others had moved on, pursuing their own projects, and had little interest in revisiting the past. But there was one person who might hold the key to the whole mystery. A former producer who had worked on the project, someone who had disappeared from the public eye shortly after the sessions wrapped. Rumor had it that this producer knew exactly what had happened to the tapes, but he was nowhere to be found. The clock was ticking. The courtroom drama was just beginning, and Jack knew that if he didn't get the truth soon, the tapes and the story might be lost forever. As Jack dug deeper into the mystery, the walls surrounding the truth only seemed to grow taller. He tracked down old colleagues, producers, and even roadies who had been part of that fateful tour, hoping someone could shed light on the whereabouts of those lost tapes. But every conversation seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Some claimed to have seen the tapes shortly after they were recorded, but the details were vague, almost as if they were hesitant to speak about it. Others dismissed it as water under the bridge, as if the tapes were no longer worth chasing, and Jack should move on with his life. But he couldn't. Not when there was still a chance to find them. Not when the thought of that lost music, those moments that had never been shared with the world, gnawed at him. And then there were the rumors. Rumors that someone within the record company had destroyed the tapes on purpose, afraid that the raw, unpolished music might never sell. The fear of a commercial failure, a fear that still loomed over the music industry, might have been enough to justify erasing what they saw as a flop in waiting. But Jack didn't want to believe it. He'd always assumed the record company respected the artists they signed, even if it was just for the sake of profit. Why would they intentionally destroy the work of someone they had so heavily invested in? It didn't add up, but neither did the absence of those tapes. As the years dragged on, Jack's desperation grew. He filed requests, reached out to legal teams, and even tried going public with his story, hoping to stir up interest. But the corporate machine was vast and powerful, and the record company seemed to have a way of shrugging off any attempt to question their actions. With every call that went unanswered and every legal roadblock he encountered, Jack felt a tightening in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened to those tapes. And they were hiding it. It wasn't until Jack made a bold move that the case took a dramatic turn. He filed a lawsuit, not just for the tapes, but for the history that had been stolen from him, from his bandmates, and from the world. The courtroom battle was set. The record company, now a massive conglomerate, would have to answer for what they had done or what they hadn't done. But as the legal proceedings began, the full scope of the conflict revealed itself in ways Jack had never expected. Former bandmates were subpoenaed to testify. Some of them, like Pete, the bassist who had walked away from the industry years ago, showed up eager to speak out. Pete had always been the quiet one, the one who never cared much for the limelight. But when it came to those tapes, he had a lot to say. He was convinced that the tapes had been destroyed intentionally, not just for commercial reasons but because they held something more dangerous. Something that could have exposed deep flaws in the music industry itself. Pete was convinced the tapes were too raw, too real. They might have shown the cracks in the image they had all worked so hard to cultivate. But not all of Jack's former bandmates were on his side. There was Alan, the lead guitarist, who had become a household name in his own right after their split. Alan had always been the most commercially minded of the group. He'd moved on from their early days, leaving behind the messy drama that followed the band's rise and fall. When asked about the tapes, Alan's response was telling. If they're lost, they're lost. No one's going to remember those tracks anyway. His indifference stung Jack, but what was worse was the look in Alan's eyes. A look that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. But the tension didn't just live in the courtroom. The more Jack pressed, the more shadows seemed to creep in from the corners of his past. He started to receive anonymous letters, cryptic notes that only deepened the mystery. One letter, postmarked from an unknown city, read, "The music is better off forgotten. Let the past stay buried." Another came with an old photograph of the band, taken during the very sessions they'd recorded those lost tracks. There was no return address, no signature, just a faded image and a warning. With every lead that turned cold, Jack's resolve grew. But so did the stakes. As the trial continued, it became clear that someone was watching him, following his every move. The case wasn't just about finding lost tapes anymore. It had become a battle for Jack's own legacy. And it wasn't just his name on the line. It was the truth of what had happened during one of rock's most pivotal moments. The deeper Jack dug, the more it seemed like the past was fighting back. But who was behind it all? Who stood to lose the most if these tapes saw the light of day? And what were they willing to do to keep it hidden? The answers were just beyond reach, hanging like a dark cloud over everything Jack had fought for. The more Jack pushed, the more the walls seemed to close in. Every door he knocked on led to a dead end. Every lead he followed ended in a labyrinth of contradictions. But something in his gut told him that the truth was just out of reach. And with each passing day, the desire to uncover it grew stronger, as did the pressure from the looming threat of time. His health had begun to decline, a constant reminder that the clock was ticking. He couldn't wait forever for a solution that might never come. Then, out of nowhere, came a breakthrough. A former bandmate, Mark, who had always been tight-lipped about the past, suddenly called Jack. Mark's voice on the other end of the line was barely recognizable. His words rushed, almost frantic. He claimed to have information about the tapes, but there was a catch. Mark wouldn't share it over the phone. Jack needed to meet him in person. The meeting was set for a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, a place far from the prying eyes of the music world. The meeting was tense from the start. Mark hadn't aged as gracefully as Jack. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow, as though the weight of years spent hiding secrets had finally caught up with him. As soon as Jack sat down, Mark pushed a crumpled envelope across the table. Inside was an old photograph, faded, yellowing, and a note. The photo showed a familiar scene, a late-night recording session at a studio, the very one where Jack had laid down the tracks that were now missing. But there was something else in the photo that immediately caught Jack's eye. The label on the tape reel in the background. It read, "Do not erase. Historical recording." Mark's voice lowered to a whisper. "I never wanted to be involved in this, Jack. But they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. The tapes, they were never destroyed. They're still in the company vault. But you're not the only one looking for them." Jack felt his pulse quicken. His mind raced, processing what Mark had just said. The tapes were still out there, locked away, hidden from the world. But if they hadn't been destroyed, why hadn't they been released? And who else could be after them? Mark continued, his words now laced with fear. "I overheard them talking once, people high up at the label. They didn't want anyone to hear what was on those tapes. Not just because they were different, but because of what was on them. There's a song that could change everything." Jack sat frozen, trying to grasp the full meaning of Mark's words. A song? What song? And why would it be so dangerous? Before Jack could ask more questions, Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He glanced around the cafe, clearly paranoid. "You don't have much time, Jack. They know you're looking. Get to the vault before it's too late. They won't let you walk away again." Mark turned and hurried out of the cafe, leaving Jack with more questions than answers. The photograph, the note, the song that could change everything. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. The pieces were falling into place, but they didn't form a clear picture. Who else was after the tapes? And what was so dangerous about the lost song? His only option was to follow the trail wherever it led, even if it meant risking everything. His career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. With the clock ticking down and the danger escalating, Jack made a decision. He would break into the company vault himself if it came to that. The mystery of the lost tapes had haunted him for too long. Now it was time to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But as Jack prepared to take the next step, a chilling thought crept into his mind. What if the tapes weren't just locked away because of their potential to change rock history? What if the record company had known something more? A dark secret about that missing song that could destroy everything Jack had worked for. The suspense was unbearable. Every clue pointed to a greater conspiracy, and Jack was only beginning to realize just how high the stakes really were. Would he find the tapes before they were erased for good? Or would he become part of the cover-up? A ghost in the annals of rock history, forever haunted by what might have been. "They're still in the vaults," Mark continued, his voice trembling. "But not where you think. They're hidden, Jack. Locked away in a part of the building that doesn't even show up on any of the company's records. I never wanted to get involved with this mess. But I knew I had to tell you before it was too late." Jack leaned in, his mind racing. Hidden? Locked away? This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. For a moment, a flicker of hope stirred inside him, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. Why would they keep the tapes hidden? Why not just erase them? Why go to all this trouble to keep them out of sight? And who else was involved in keeping the secret? Mark's eyes darted around the cafe, as though he feared someone was watching. "Listen, I don't know everything, but I know that whoever's behind this has been playing a much bigger game. The tapes aren't just valuable for the music they hold. They're a part of something much bigger, Jack. Something that goes back further than you or me." His voice dropped even lower. "This isn't just about the company anymore. There are people with much more power involved. People who have been pulling the strings from the shadows." Jack's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about corporate negligence or a simple case of lost tapes anymore. Someone or something was actively keeping this music hidden. But why? What was it about this particular recording that was so important to them? Jack had always known that the album was special, but he never imagined it could be the key to something much larger. His mind whirled with possibilities, none of which made sense. Mark's face tightened, and he looked down at his hands, as though he was weighing something heavy. I tried to dig deeper, Jack. I thought I could find out more. But every time I got close, I was shut down. There's something going on that no one wants us to know. I think they've been hiding the truth all these years, and now it's coming back to bite them. Before Jack could ask another question, Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. You need to leave now. They're watching me. They know I've been talking to you. I've already said too much. Without another word, he turned and hurried out of the cafe, disappearing into the streets, leaving Jack to sit in stunned silence. What the hell was happening? Jack's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Hidden tapes, shady corporate practices, and now this mention of powerful forces pulling strings from behind the scenes. He had come here to find answers, but now it seemed like he had only stumbled deeper into a labyrinth of lies and secrets. The stakes had just been raised to an unimaginable level. It was no longer just a matter of recovering some lost recordings. It was about uncovering a conspiracy, one that could shake the foundations of the music industry itself. As he walked out of the cafe, the weight of Mark's words settled heavily on him. He had to get to the vaults. He had to find those tapes. But now, with everything he had learned, Jack knew he wasn't just fighting for a piece of his past. He was stepping into a war he didn't fully understand, against enemies more powerful than he ever imagined. And no matter how deep he dug, the truth might be even darker than he was prepared to face. He had to make a decision. Would he continue on this path, knowing the danger it would bring, or would he walk away and leave the past buried forever? The answer was simple. He had already come too far. Mark's voice faltered as he continued. Every time I got close, I was shut down. Threats of veiled warnings. The tapes, Jack, they're not just music. They're part of a bigger plan, something connected to the company's shady dealings back in the late 70s. If those recordings ever get out, the entire narrative they've built could collapse. Mark paused, his breath shaky. And now they've realized you're looking for them. Jack's blood ran cold. The weight of the situation hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about music anymore. This was about power, manipulation, and a history that had been buried for decades. He could feel the stakes rising higher than ever. They were hiding something far more dangerous than lost tapes. They were hiding a truth that could rewrite everything. The companies, the artists, the entire music industry, everything was on the line. Without a moment to waste, Jack rushed back to the record company's headquarters, heart pounding in his chest. The walls of the building now felt like a prison. He had to find those tapes. But as he stepped into the cold, sterile lobby, something felt off. There was an unspoken tension in the air, an uneasy calm that suggested he wasn't the only one on a mission today. As he made his way to the back of the building, through corridors he had never seen before, his gut told him he was getting closer. His eyes scanned every door, every corner, until finally he reached the vault, the one Mark had told him about. The vault door was hidden behind a thick curtain of bureaucracy, guarded by layers of security that had been conveniently forgotten by everyone else who had tried to access it. But Jack wasn't just anyone. He had spent decades fighting for his place in the music world. Now he was fighting for something even bigger. His fingers trembled as he swiped his credentials and bypassed the security systems with a series of quick movements. The door opened with a soft click, revealing a room filled with boxes, tapes, and files. Most of them unlabeled, dusty relics of an era long past. Jack's eyes swept over the room. He could feel the presence of history here, of music that had once been on the verge of greatness. His pulse quickened as he scanned the shelves. Then, his gaze locked onto a particular section in the far corner. Boxes marked with a symbol he didn't recognize. They were old, even older than the tapes he was looking for. And yet, there they were, buried beneath piles of forgotten junk, covered in years of dust. His breath caught in his throat as he reached out, pulling the box closer. But as he opened it, he found something he wasn't expecting. Inside were not the tapes he had been searching for, but a series of documents. Legal contracts, agreements, and a notebook filled with handwritten notes from someone he had never heard of before. As Jack flipped through the pages, the reality of what he was holding began to sink in. These weren't just business deals. They were blueprints, plans for a covert operation that spanned decades, connecting the music industry to something far darker than Jack could ever have imagined. The documents revealed a hidden agenda, one that involved influential figures in both the music and corporate world, all orchestrating a carefully constructed narrative of rock music history. The tapes weren't just lost. They had been hidden, intentionally erased from public memory because they contained the kind of music that threatened to expose the truth. This was bigger than a record company's greed. It was a cover-up that had been decades in the making. But as Jack stared at the pages, a final, chilling realization struck him. Someone was behind him. He could feel it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Too quiet, too deliberate. Before he could turn around, the door to the vault slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. A voice, cold and steady, echoed from the shadows. "I knew you'd find it eventually, Jack. But you're too late." In that moment, Jack understood. This wasn't just about music anymore. It had always been about control, about rewriting history to fit a narrative that no one but the powerful could understand. The tapes, the music, it was never just for the fans. It was a weapon. And now, he had stumbled into a game far bigger than he had ever imagined. Before he could react, a sharp sound echoed through the room, and the light flickered back on. But what Jack saw next, well, that was something he never could have predicted. Jack stood before the vault door, his heart racing. His hands were slick with sweat as he keyed in the final security code. The door clicked open with a low, ominous groan. Inside, the room was colder than he expected, a stark contrast to the tension that had been building inside him. The walls were lined with rows upon rows of old tapes, albums, and archival materials, some of which hadn't seen the light of day in decades. But it wasn't the rows of forgotten records that held Jack's attention. It was the singular, faded box sitting in the corner, marked with a label, "Do not erase." Historical recordings. Confidential. Jack's breath hitched. This was it. The tapes, the ones that had been hidden away for so long, the ones that could change everything, were right in front of him. He approached slowly, every step heavy with the weight of years spent chasing ghosts. As he carefully lifted the box, the reality of the moment hit him. He had finally found them. The recordings that had been lost to history were now within his grasp. But just as Jack was about to open the box, a voice from behind him stopped him cold. "You shouldn't have come here, Jack." It was Mark. Jack turned around to see him standing in the doorway, his face etched with regret and something darker, fear. "Mark, what are you doing here?" Mark's eyes darted nervously. "I told you there were people involved, people who would do anything to keep those tapes locked away. You've stirred up a hornet's nest." He paused, then took a deep breath. "I never meant for it to go this far. But they're watching you. They know you've found the vault." Jack stood frozen, realizing with a sickening feeling that Mark hadn't just been a passive informant in this story. Mark had been a part of the cover-up, complicit in keeping the tapes hidden. But why? What was so dangerous about these recordings? Mark stepped forward slowly. The tapes contain more than just songs. They're connected to a deal, a secret agreement that involved powerful figures in the industry. The recordings were supposed to be a blueprint for a new era in music, one that never came to be. But it wasn't just about music. It was about control, Jack. Control over the future of rock itself. The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. These tapes weren't just the missing link between musical eras. They were a weapon, a key to a power struggle that had been unfolding behind the scenes for decades. Suddenly, the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. These tapes could not only rewrite the past, they could shape the future of music itself. As Mark spoke, Jack's mind raced. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the integrity of music, the preservation of a legacy that had been hijacked by those who sought to control it for their own gain. He had to make a choice. He could walk away, let the tapes vanish once again into the shadows, or he could take a stand and release them no matter the cost. Without a word, Jack made his decision. He grabbed the box, clutching it to his chest. "This music deserves to be heard," he said firmly. "No more secrets." Mark looked at him with a mixture of admiration and fear. "You're not ready for the consequences, Jack." But Jack didn't care. The music, those tapes, had to be heard. As he stepped out of the vault, he could already hear the echoes of the songs in his mind, knowing that they would soon reach the world. The truth had finally been uncovered, and the music, at long last, would take its place in history. In the end, Jack didn't just reclaim his legacy. He'd brought to light a piece of rock history that had been buried for far too long. The tapes were released, sparking a firestorm in the music world, one that would burn through the layers of corporate greed and control. And though the consequences would be far-reaching, Jack knew one thing for certain: the world would never be the same again. As the music played, it wasn't just history that was being rewritten, it was the future of rock itself.